The Industrial Revolution and the age that followed has come and gone in the West. The oligarchs knocked the United States off the gold standard after it was clear that the government was lying about its reserves during the Vietnam War.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
China was opened for trade along with a string of other trade deals over the following decades, allowing the rich and their corporations to outsource manufacturing to the Third World, where they could go back to the exploit and exhaust labor practices they had enjoyed before the labor movements of the 1800s. Outside of the weapons industry, the United States has been fleeced of its manufacturing base, and the economic boom of the post-World War II era that created a strong economy and middle class has come to an end. With manufacturing and industry sent offshore to the Third World, the First World countries of the West are now entering into the information age.
Secure from the pests of their contradictory thoughts. Unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Our social political system of faux democracy is being replaced by the long-planned technocracy, where technology and the managerial class that runs it will control society.
Technocracy was defined very succinctly in 1938 by their own publication, the Technocratic magazine. And they call it a system of scientific engineering of, society. They saw themselves as a merger between hard science and social science, which really is an oxymoron. Social science is not really a science, in my opinion. But they really believed that. So they believed that they could take their scientific method that they used in the hard sciences and apply it to society. They also believed that they alone were the only ones that could run society correctly as a result of technology having come in and changed the fabric of society. They hated politicians. They hated the establishment, the organization of society the way it was, because it was not efficient. It was not, conservation-based, if you will, to conserve resources. And so they just kind of took it upon themselves to define an economic model that would replace capitalism and free enterprise. And that's exactly what it was, a replacement economic system.
Where the monopolization and control of resources such as fossil fuels were essential for the oligarchs to maintain total control over society during the industrial age, it is now essential that they monopolize and control information in order for them to maintain their power and domination over society in the information age. International banking cartels and corporations have taken reality hostage, and have worked to destroy objective truth through the hijacking of our bribe-based government and the creation of corporate mass media. Knowing is no longer just half the battle, it's the whole war. A very few at the top have been controlling and culling the masses as they see fit for ages. Now they have centralized the control of technology in such a way as to control the way we perceive ourselves and the world around us on a daily basis. By tearing away the objective truth that adheres civilization, those at the top of the pyramid are debasing our society down to nothing in order to rebuild it in their image, and they're doing so through the manipulation of information and technology.
I've been wearing like my sister's tutus since I was like 3s and 4s, even like 2s, and I've been dancing around in like little pink dresses and stuff. So yeah, I think I've had lactation inside of me since I was born, and that's why I love that song, Born This Way.
We just want our kids to express themselves however they see fit, as long as it's respectful and they're nice people. We really don't care.
I like dancing, and I like performing, and I love, not only I love dressing up. It makes me feel very happy, like I am accepted,
Girls, delightful in Cuba, stop. Could send you prose poems about scenery, but don't feel right spending your money. Stop. There is no war in Cuba. Signed, Wheeler. Any answer?
Yes, dear Wheeler, you provide the prose poems. I'll provide the war.
Over the decades, the government has been working with its controlled media to see how much control they can exert over the population and how easily the public will take the bait. We will quickly go through these litmus tests, hoaxes, and false flags from the Great Moon hoax of 1835 to the manipulated current events and chaotic narrative growing out of the Las Vegas massacre. But first let us look at some important terms and definitions that we have taken for granted in the past, but cannot afford to take for granted in the future. There are two definitions for the word truth. Definition 1, that which is true or in accordance with fact or reality. Definition 2, a fact or belief that is accepted as true. That there are two definitions for the word truth in the first place should raise alarm bells. The second definition sounds dubious after hearing the first, as it allows for fact and reality to be contrived yet still serve as the truth so long as it is accepted as belief, a shifty explanation presented in defense of religion, patriotism, and your average snake oil peddler or charlatan. Now that we've seen the double-speak presented to define truth, let's check out truth's ugly cousins, information and disinformation. Information. Definition 1, facts provided or learned about something or someone. Definition 2, what is conveyed or represented by a particular arrangement or sequence of things. As you can see, like the word truth, information also gets two definitions. One that's straight-laced and grounded in facts and reality, and another that sounds slippery, malleable, and loose with the truth. What's funny is that definition number 1 represents information in the context of law, while the second definition presents information in the context of science and computing. But we will leave religion, scientism, and the prison of belief for another time and another video. Let's continue defining the terms by which our truth and reality are represented to us, and by whom. Disinformation is defined as false information that is intended to mislead, especially propaganda issued by a government organization to a rival power or the media. In 1981, CIA Director William Casey reported to President Reagan during their first staff meeting that, quote, "We'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." This tells us two things. Number 1, the government had rather program the people with disinformation than to tell them the truth. And number 2, the government considers the people a rival power. Now that we've defined information and disinformation, it is crucial that we understand the importance of misinformation. Misinformation has only one definition, and it is as follows: false or inaccurate information, especially that which is deliberately intended to deceive. As you can see, misinformation and disinformation have very similar definitions. However, this small difference in definition plays a crucial role in how those in power are able to persuade the people to believe in the official state narrative, whether it has to do with an ongoing news event, or supporting state decisions on domestic and foreign policy.
August 2nd, 1990. Iraq attacks Kuwait, claiming the Kuwaitis are slant drilling into Iraq's oil fields. U.S. President George Herbert Walker Bush pushes for a land war against Iraq. But polls show the U.S. public is split 50-50 on that idea. Then comes this eyewitness testimony before a congressional committee from a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl. The claim is she cannot be identified for fear of reprisals.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The U.S. public is outraged. The result? Support for land war zooms. It's a turning point. Desert Storm is launched. 135,000 Iraqis are killed. An estimated 1 million Iraqis, many of them children and old people, then die as a result of 10 years of sanctions. One small problem. There never were any incubator baby deaths, not one. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's investigative flagship program, The Fifth Estate, reveals the girl to be the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, given her lines and coached in acting by the giant American PR firm Hill & Knowlton. It's one phase in a $10 million joint U.S.-Kuwaiti campaign of deception. This man is lying.
I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators.
This man is lying.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
There were a lot of people who participated in a conspiracy. Yes, an out-and-out conspiracy of fake organizations, false documents, fraud, and disinformation.
It is important to know that what those in power want the most is to remain in power. Power is the means and the end. Now that we understand this, it is important for us to understand that the government is not the top of the power structure. We are indoctrinated through our education system and upbringing to believe that we live in a democracy where the government is of, by, and for the people. One nation under God, blah blah blah. The United States of America is a corporation, and the government merely serves as a corporate board of trustees. We the people are presented with the illusion of control through the power to elect its members and president. The people actually hold none of this power. The oligarchs, those owners and controllers of the world's resources, have their own machinations in place to both select government officials, and, at the same time convince we the people that we control the ascension of these pre-selected leaders. Most Americans cannot understand this simple truth. They fight it with all their might, believing that a vote serves as their individual voice echoing and resonating through halls of power to sway the way in which the world works. While this is as laughable as it sounds, the majority of people in this country believe in this blatant lie, even while being told that the Electoral College makes their individual vote all but worthless. So why, with all the evidence to the contrary, does the majority of the country live this mass delusion that the government is of the people, by the people, and for the people, and that truth and justice is the American way? The way in which those in power create and control this mass delusional, hive-minded collective, is through propaganda. Propaganda is perhaps the most important term we hope to define and explain in this presentation, as it uses all the other terms we've defined so far together in order to manipulate, destroy, and recreate what the truth is perceived, and, more importantly, believed by the collective populace. The definition of propaganda is as follows: information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political point of view. Before we look into propaganda, how it works, and how it allows the agenda of others to control our truth, we should meet the father of public relations himself, Edward Bernays.
In essence, all humans are the same. We are essentially clones of each other. From the moment we are born, we are hardwired with many of the same traits. We smile when we are happy. We feel a sense of justice. We all share similar ideas about morality. All societies, primitive and advanced, have mechanisms that cause them to be fluid. The mechanisms might be markets or laws, governments or unions. Society should harness the mechanisms that generate the things that we all share, things that we consider to be sacred, such as freedom, leisure, and happiness. We all share these ideas because they are innate. They are embedded into our DNA and expressed by our very nature. Democracy, voting as a system of participatory self-governance, is supposed to be one of these self-correcting mechanisms. It should generate a society that values our most important ideals. But there is a major flaw that's been exploited. The man who found out how to exploit this weakness was Edward Bernays. He is considered the father of public relations and one of the major contributors to the field of marketing. Bernays believed that people were inherently stupid, that they could be easily persuaded not by rational thought, but by appealing to their emotions. If people are evil, stupid, irrational, and if they are ruled by a mob-like mentality, then, as Bernays reasoned, they must be controlled. Democracy must be shaped, or at least prevented from functioning fully. To do this, Bernays went to the teaching of his uncle, Sigmund Freud. Freud believed that people were influenced by unconscious desires. With this knowledge, Bernays concluded that you couldn't influence the public by appealing to rational thought, but instead, their irrational emotions. In the 1920s, one of Edward Bernays' first clients was the American Tobacco Corporation. At the time, there was a taboo against women smoking in public. The president of the American Tobacco Corporation, George Hill, complained to Bernays that his company was losing half of its potential market. Bernays hired psychologists to figure out why. The conclusion was that cigarettes were a form of male sexual power, but that women could undermine this power by smoking themselves. It was a form of women's rights. In one of his first experiments, Bernays was able to convince a group of rich debutantes to pull out their cigarettes during the Easter parade in New York City. Bernays informed the newspaper that he heard that these women were going to be protesting. He knew the media would show up, and when they did, Bernays gave the women the signal to light up in front of the cameras with banners reading, "Torches of Freedom." The next day, the event was covered not just in the New York papers, but around the world. The experiment was a success. Edward Bernays had broken the taboo in just one event. Soon, it became a powerful symbol for women to smoke. Just by smoking, women were sending a message that they were equal to men, that they were just as powerful and independent. But the reality is, smoking cigarettes doesn't make you powerful. Bernays realized that he could use products to appeal not to a person's rationality, but to their emotions. Just by making a person feel special, powerful, sexy, independent, proud, happy, or excited, he could manipulate the general masses. Soon after this event, the sales of cigarettes to women skyrocketed. In 1928, Edward Bernays wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized." The business sector in America had become interested in Edward Bernays' new method of manipulating the public. At the time, business had appealed to people to buy their products because they had to have them. They were products that we all depend on, like toothpaste and shoes. Bernays would advise the private sector against this. Instead, he would appeal to people's emotional desires. Cars would no longer be sold because they were reliable machines, but instead, they gave the driver a sense of freedom, luxury, the feeling of being special, that they might be better than their neighbor. Paul Mazur of Lehman Brothers, a man who employed Bernays, said, "We must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire. People must want new things before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desire must overshadow his needs." The rest of corporate America agreed. Soon, demand for Bernays' services became overwhelming. Other public relations companies began to proliferate around America. Almost every major corporation came to use the method of public relations. They would appeal to people's most primal desires based not on democratic values, but on market principles. Because of these new methods, the private sector became all-powerful. Some companies, such as the United Fruit Company, had owned massive quantities of land in Guatemala. The company had come to support a series of dictators in the country. In 1951, President Arbenz became the democratically elected president of Guatemala on the platform of reform. One of his reforms was to unleash the grip of United Fruit over the country. The Congress voted for land reform in which they would buy unused parcels of land held by United Fruit and hand that land over to poor families to be used. While the public was overwhelmingly supportive of the reforms, a tiny group of elites and the United Fruit Company became threatened. The company turned to Bernays to deal with what they saw as a crisis. Because Arbenz was so popular, Bernays decided not to manipulate public opinion in Guatemala, but instead, he would appeal to the United States government. At the time, the threat of Soviet communism was in every facet of American life. Even though Guatemala was a capitalist country, Bernays had to convince the US and its public that Arbenz was a puppet of the Soviet, even though there was no connection. Bernays had to use people's fears on themselves and turn Arbenz into the single greatest threat to American democracy. Edward Bernays gathered a group of journalists from America to travel to Guatemala to meet with a small group of anti-Arbenz politicians. They convinced the journalists that Arbenz was a communist with links to the Soviet Empire. At the same time, Bernays created a phony, independent news agency in the United States called the Middle America Information Bureau. Their task was to overwhelm the media with threats of an Arbenz government by saying that Moscow was to use Guatemala as a base to attack America. The plan worked. All over America, newspapers and people were talking about an imminent attack by this small, almost completely defenseless country. While all this was happening, United Fruit Company was lobbying the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower became convinced that Guatemala was a menace to American democracy. He ordered the CIA to overthrow the country by arming and training a rebel army. Then, the CIA created what they called a terror campaign by bombing Guatemala City. On June 27, 1954, Arbenz fled to Mexico. Eventually, Carlos Armas seized power and became dictator. He angered the public by reversing land reform. With a request from the CIA, Armas created the National Committee of Defense Against Communism. The group is generally acknowledged to be Latin America's first modern death squad. He purged the government and trade unions of people suspected of left-wing sympathies, banned political parties and peasant organizations, and restored the secret police force. All of this eventually led to the Guatemalan Civil War, in which 200,000 civilians were killed, most of them murdered by the U.S.-supported government and death squads. While the name Edward Bernays is unknown to most Americans, he's had a major impact on our lives. He worked for the Wilson, Hoover, and Eisenhower administration. He rubbed shoulders with the most powerful men in America, and he was employed by almost every major corporation in the U.S., including New Jersey Bell Telephone, Procter & Gamble, American Tobacco Company, General Electric, Dodge Motors, CBS, and Bethlehem Steel. The real irony is that Bernays was convinced that the public had to be controlled because they were irrational, that democracy had to be prevented. But in doing so, he actually made people irrational and turned them into the mob he so feared. Edward Bernays undermined democracy, the one mechanism that has self-perfecting features, and replaced that with another mechanism, one that brings out the worst human qualities such as greed, selfishness, power, envy. Bernays played on our pretensions, our lusts, fears, ignorance, and dreams, all in the name of another mechanism that runs societies, all in the name of private enterprise. That is what he referred to as the invisible government. The people who control this great mechanism are the ones who have the power and the money to manipulate entire societies for their will, for their beliefs, and for their greed. They have capitalized on our most primal and fear-based emotions and exploited them, turning citizens into truly irrational beings.
Even with the likes of Bernays working in the shadows spinning propaganda and nudging public opinion in the direction of the oligarchical deep state's agenda, those at the top of the pyramid have taken no chances when it comes to total control of the mass media. While we have been taught all our lives that the journalistic media is the paragon of virtue and truth standing at the ready to keep the government and corporations honest and in line with the desires and moral fortitude of the people, it is, in reality, anything but. In fact, between laws like the Sedition Act and the bought and paid for media outlets, not to mention the control wielded by the Council on Foreign Relations and the CIA infiltration of print, radio, and television media through Operation Mockingbird in the early 1950s, journalists are merely witting and unwitting gatekeepers tasked with keeping state secrets secret, and the true intentions of the state away from the prying eyes and ears of the public.
Once war was declared, conformity, patriotism, and complete support for the war were demanded of all Americans. Freedom of speech and thought was becoming unacceptable. Different language and culture suspicious. German Americans in particular were scrutinized and their loyalty questioned. Schools dropped German from their language classes. German books were withdrawn from public libraries. German measles was renamed Liberty Measles, and sauerkraut, Liberty Cabbage. Frederick Stock, the distinguished conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, was not allowed to conduct and many other orchestras refused to play the music of Bach and Beethoven. Soon, these sentiments manifested into anti-German violence. The most notorious case occurred in Collinsville, Illinois, when German-born Robert Prager was lynched. Intolerance spread beyond German Americans. William Harding, then governor of Iowa, made a brash proclamation.
Conversation in public places, on trains, or over the telephone should be in the English language.
People who spoke Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Czech, on top of those who spoke German, were affected. Elderly women were jailed for speaking German over the telephone. A Lutheran pastor was imprisoned for preaching part of a funeral service for a soldier killed in the war in Swedish. His explanation that he did it because the young man's grandparents couldn't speak English did not sway the judge. Governor Harding even maintained that God did not hear prayers that were spoken in any language other than English. In June of 1917, Congress passed and President Wilson signed the Espionage Act, and 11 months later, the Sedition Act. Under these laws, a person could be fined as much as $10,000 and could be sentenced to as many as 20 years in prison for anti-war activities, like interfering with the draft or with the sale of government bonds. Imprisonment could result from saying anything disloyal, profane, or abusive concerning the war effort. Despite the fact that these two acts violated the First Amendment to the Constitution, the right of free speech, the Supreme Court upheld their constitutionality, claiming that there was a clear and present danger to free speech and a free press during a war. The result was that citizens were harassed purely upon suspicion. Walter Matthey was jailed for the high crime of attending an anti-war meeting and contributing a quarter to the cause. Under the Act, the post office could censor the mail, and over 400 periodicals were banned for a time, including the Saturday Evening Post and the New York Times. Robert Goldstein ran afoul of the law with his film, The Spirit of '76. It was just a silent movie about the Revolutionary War, and of course the British were portrayed as America's enemy. Now, however, America and Great Britain were allies, and Goldstein was told to remove scenes of British soldiers shooting colonists. He refused and was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Goldstein served 3 years, and his career never recovered. But the worst treatment under the Espionage and Sedition Acts was reserved for socialists and labor leaders. The founder of the Socialist Party and frequent presidential candidate, Eugene V. Debs, was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment on each of 3 counts to be served concurrently for his outspoken opposition to the war.
I have been accused of obstructing the war, I admit it. Gentlemen, I abhor war.
Undaunted, Debs ran for president from his jail cell in the Atlanta prison in 1920 and got almost 1 million votes. In 1921, President Warren Harding commuted his sentence. Emma Goldman, an anarchist, a person who believes there should be no government, was fined $10,000 and given 2 years in jail for denouncing the draft. On her release, she was promptly deported to Russia. Labor organizer Big Bill Haywood was convicted of sabotaging the war effort because he encouraged workers to strike for fair pay and decent working conditions. Haywood received a sentence of 20 years for his troubles, but jumped bail and fled to Russia, where he remained until his death 10 years later. On President Wilson's last day in office, Congress repealed the Sedition Act. Ironically, while American soldiers fought for freedom in Europe, freedom of speech and civil liberties were being denied to Americans at home.
The year is 1917, and Representative Oscar Callaway enters a disturbing statement into the U.S. Congressional Record. The statement reveals why J.P. Morgan interests hired 12 high-ranking news managers. The 12 were asked to determine the most influential newspapers in America. They were to figure out how many news organizations it would take to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. The 12 found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, and an editor was placed at each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the new policy. Soon, that policy would be defined by a front group formed by J.P. Morgan and his colleagues. In fact, Morgan's personal attorney was founding president of the organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, the CFR maintains that its goal is to increase America's understanding of the world. However, the actual objective of this highly exclusive club is revealed by the rare admissions of the insiders themselves. In the early 60s, a Georgetown University professor collects information for a book favorable to the network of powerful men who founded the CFR. For 2 years, Professor Carroll Quigley is allowed to examine the confidential papers and secret records of this network. Quigley reveals that these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control of the entire world. And the CFR is their most visible conduit for carrying out that agenda. CFR members include America's wealthiest tycoons, as well as the highly placed elite in government, academic institutions, tax-exempt foundations, and the establishment media. Ruling Class Journalists, written by Richard Harwood, describes the CFR membership as the ruling establishment in the United States. The Washington Post article boasted that news reporters who are CFR members do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy for the United States, they help make it. Who are these policymakers? Many of their faces are familiar. NBC's Tom Brokaw, CBS's Dan Rather, ABC's Barbara Walters, Jim Lehrer of PBS, William F. Buckley of National Review, media mogul Rupert Murdoch, owner of the giant multifaceted News Corporation. These media heavyweights, and many others like them, are members of the CFR. Powerful corporations are also invited to become members. At the close of the 20th century, CFR influence presided over far-reaching consolidations of media control. In 1995, CFR members Michael Eisner of Disney and ABC's Thomas Murphy merged their media empires. Soon after the merger, the Disney-ABC empire becomes a CFR corporate member. In the year 2000, the world's largest internet service provider, America Online, joins forces with Time Warner, one of the world's largest news organizations. The CEOs favoring the move are CNN's Thomas Johnson and Time Warner's Gerald Levin, both CFR members. Once again, another media giant is created under the shadow of CFR influence. Today, an elite handful of individuals define the agendas that are supported by the empire of establishment news.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. And we're looking at that very carefully.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks.
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole News and Public Affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
We have quite a lot of detailed information, and we will evaluate it, and we will include any evidence of wrongdoing or any evidence of impropriety in our final report and make recommendations.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
Senator, do you think that you named the news organizations in your final report?
That remains to be decided.
I think it was entirely in order for our correspondents at that time to make use of CIA agent chiefs of station and other members of the executive staff of CIA as sources of information which were useful in their assessments of world conditions.
Would you say that continues today?
Well, I would think probably for a reporter it would continue today, but because of all of the revelations of the period of the 1970s, it seems to me that a reporter's got to be much more circumspect in doing it now, or he runs the risk of at least being looked at with considerable disfavor by the public. I think you've got to be much more careful about it.
Now that we've defined some of the terms needed to understand what information is, how it can be manipulated, disseminated, and distributed to an unwitting public to push the corporate, state agenda, we will use our upcoming video to break down some of the most blatant false flags, hoaxes, and made-for-media events that have swayed minds, created wars, and invented history, and hopefully shed light on the individuals and government institutions responsible for their initiation and accomplishment.